This series is a strategic scenario built from real data, historical precedents, and official statements. This is not a prediction, it's a projection. Venezuela sits on more oil than Saudi Arabia. 303 billion barrels at today's prices, that's $24 trillion. Now ask yourself, who could afford to ignore that? Analysts suggest that behind the official justifications, the real story is about controlling the planet's most valuable resource. But that's only half the story. According to a report from OPEC, beneath Venezuela's soil lies the world's largest proven oil reserve. In a world where the dollar's hegemony is being challenged, what would a nation do to control a $24 trillion prize? And how did Venezuela go from being an ally to a primary adversary? It was called the Saudi Arabia of Latin America. Then, it became a wasteland. The reason why is a warning for everyone. In the 1970s, Venezuela was the richest country on the continent. So how did it fall into ruin? The phenomenon is known as the Dutch disease, but the real story is much more sinister. The oil wealth was so immense that it destroyed everything else. And this is where things get dangerous. The World Bank reports that with the oil boom of the 2000s, Venezuela began importing over 70% of the food it consumed when the price of oil plummeted from over $100 to less than $30. The country collapsed. Was the crisis just bad economic luck, or was it the result of deliberate mismanagement that left the country vulnerable, setting the stage for what was to come? First, you apply pressure to a country economy. Then, you watch what happens. Washington called it sanctions. With the economy in a freefall, Washington saw an opportunity. Supporters of U.S. policy argue this targeted corruption, but the data reveals a darker truth. What happened next changed everything. A report from the Center for Economic and Policy Research, or CAPR, estimated that U.S. sanctions contributed to over 40,000 deaths in Venezuela. Between 2017 and 2018, the U.S. government disputes this, claiming the regime's corruption is the sole culprit. Were the sanctions a necessary tool, or were they a form of economic warfare that punished the civilian population, justifying a more drastic intervention? For 70 years, the U.S. and Venezuela were strategic partners. Venezuela was a reliable supplier of oil. The U.S. was its biggest customer, but in 1999, everything changed. What turned America, its trading partner, to its number one enemy in the region? Hugo Chávez was elected in 1998 with a promise to end corruption and inequality. He rewrote the Constitution, nationalized key sectors of the economy, and challenged U.S. hegemony. For his supporters, he was a savior. For his enemies, a dictator. Was Chávez's revolution a legitimate democratic project, or was it the beginning of the end of Venezuelan democracy? In April 2002, Chávez was overthrown by a military coup. He was back in power 47 hours later. But who was behind the coup? The U.S. government recognized the interim government, but denied any involvement. But declassified documents tell a different story. Did the U.S. actively support the coup, or did it just know and do nothing? For Chávez, the proof of conspiracy was clear. After the coup, Chávez radicalized. He expropriated hundreds of private companies, including the assets of American giants like ExxonMobil and ConocoPhillips. For Chávez, it was an act of sovereignty. For the companies, it was theft. Was it a legitimate act of a sovereign state to reclaim its resources? Or was it an illegal expropriation that destroyed the investment climate in the country? In 2013, Chávez died of cancer. His successor was Nicolás Maduro, a former bus driver and union leader. He lacked Chávez's charisma but inherited his power and the country's problems. Was Maduro the legitimate heir to the Bolivarian Revolution, or was he just a puppet of the Cuban regime and the Venezuelan military? In 2014, the price of oil plummeted from over $100 a barrel to less than $30 for Venezuela, which depended on oil for 96% of its export revenue. It was a catastrophe. The economy imploded, and the humanitarian crisis began. Was Maduro a victim of a global price crisis, Or did his mismanagement make a bad situation catastrophic? More than 8 million Venezuelans have fled their country. It is the largest refugee crisis in the history of the Americas. They fled hunger, violence, and lack of hope. But the world was slow to react. When a quarter of a nation's population flees, is it still an internal problem? Or does it become a threat to regional and global stability? To circumvent U.S. sanctions, the Maduro regime launched the Petro, a cryptocurrency backed by oil reserves. It was a desperate and innovative move, but did it work? The U.S. government declared the Petro illegal, and the crypto market was skeptical. Are cryptocurrencies a tool for financial liberation for sanctioned countries? Or are they just a new way to facilitate illicit activities and money laundering? In 2018, Maduro was re-elected in an election widely considered fraudulent. The main opposition candidates were barred from running or imprisoned. The US, the European Union, and most of Latin America did not recognize the result. The stage was set for the final confrontation. Was the 2018 election the moment when diplomatic options were exhausted? And was the policy of maximum pressure that followed the inevitable consequence, or a deliberate choice to escalate the conflict? A gasoline price hike, a sick policy decision, and the nation erupted into chaos. To understand the rise of Chávez, we need to go back to 1989. The prosperous Venezuela hit a social time bomb, and the explosion was brutal. But this explosion would change the course of history. In February 1989, a gasoline price hike, part of an IMF austerity package, triggered the Caracazo. The official death toll was 270, but NGOs point to over 2,000 missing. How could a country considered the richest in Latin America explode into such a violent revolt? And how did the event plant the seed for the rise of a radical leader? A failed coup, a 70-second speech, and a legend was born. The Caracazo revolt made way for radical figures. In 1992, an unknown lieutenant colonel attempted a coup. He failed, but his surrender speech turned him into a legend. And this moment would add through decades. Upon surrendering, Hugo Chávez made a 70-second televised statement that made him famous. He said, "Unfortunately, for now, the objectives we set were not achieved." Why was a military officer who tried to overthrow an elected government seen as a hero? What does this say about the state of Venezuelan democracy at the time? Doctors arrived from Cuba. They were welcomed as saviors, but they had a hidden mission. Chávez's alliance with Cuba was fundamental to his survival. Supporters call it socialist solidarity. Critics, however, see a more sinister pace, and the numbers tell a different story. Venezuela sent 100,000 barrels of oil per day to Cuba in exchange for 30,000 professionals, including doctors and, crucially, intelligence and military advisors, as reported by Reuters. Was this a fair trade? Or was it Chávez's way of importing the Cuban model of surveillance and social control into Venezuela? The richest country on earth couldn't feed its own people. The irony was deadly. The immense wealth from oil, paradoxal, helped destroy the Venezuelan economy. It's a phenomenon with a name, the Dutch disease. But the consequences were catastrophic. In the 2000s, with the oil boom, food imports in Venezuela jumped to over 70% of total consumption, while national agricultural production plummeted, according to the World Bank. How can a country be so rich and, at the same time, unable to produce its own food? And how did this dependency leave Venezuela vulnerable to the crisis that would follow? First, you lose an election. Then, you create a new institution. And you erase your opposition. Without Chávez's charisma, his successor, Maduro, used institutions to secure his power. And he did it brutally effectively. But the method was perfectly legal. After losing the parliament in 2015, Maduro convened a constituent assembly in 2017. The electronic voting machine company, Smartmatic, reported that the results were inflated by at least 1 million votes. When a government creates a parallel institution to nullify the power of another democratically elected one, is it a legitimate political maneuver or the end of the democratic gate? Watch Art 2 of this story on Invisible.